In our culture, when we think of the word marvel, we are probably most likely to attach the word Marvel to Marvel Comics or Marvel movies. This comic brand covers characters that make us marvel. That's why it's called Marvel. So we think of Spider-Man, or we may think of the Incredible Hulk, or we may think of Iron Man, another Marvel character. We think of Captain America, or we think of the Black Panther. There are literally dozens of fictional characters, but these are some of the most recently popular. Today, I want to think with you about someone who did not possess any superhuman traits. He's not a fictional character. I'd like to think with you about someone who even made Jesus marvel. And it was the Roman centurion of Luke chapter 7. This is pretty impressive because did you know that Jesus is only said to marvel 2 times in Scripture? In one instance, Jesus marvels in Mark chapter 6 and verse 6 at the unbelief of the people. He can't believe the signs that he's done, and yet people are still unbelieving. But here in Luke chapter 7, Jesus marvels at the incredible faith and the incredible character of a Roman centurion. Now, that may not seem significant to us at first glance, but remember that this takes place at a time when the Jews were in subjugation to the Romans. And there was considerable ambivalence towards the Romans and towards their tools of dominion. Barclay tells us a little bit more about centurions and the role they play. You might think, well, what is a centurion? What's the big deal about a centurion? Well, the centurions, he says, were the backbone of the Roman army. They were Roman warriors. In a Roman legion, there were 6,000 men in a legion. And the legion was divided into 60 centuries. Each of those centuries contained 100 men. And in command of each century, there was a centurion. These centurions were people that were the long service, the regular soldiers of the Roman army. They were responsible for the discipline of the regiment. They were the cement which held the army together. In peace and war alike, the Roman army's morale depended upon them. And so, it is this staple of the Roman army that Jesus is commending. So I want to read to you this short text again from Luke chapter 7, verses 1 through 10. And we just want to ask the question, what was it about the centurion that made Jesus marvel? Let's read the text. Luke 7 verse 1 says, when he concluded all his sayings in the hearing of the people, he entered Capernaum. So he begins his ministry in Capernaum here. And a certain centurion servant who was dear to him was sick and ready to die. So this isn't just some, fever, some minor cold. This was a sickness that led him near death. Verse 3 says, so when he heard about Jesus, he sent elders of the Jews to him. Notice the centurion doesn't go himself. He sends elders of the Jews to Jesus, pleading with him to come and heal his servant. And when they came to Jesus, they begged him earnestly, saying that the one for whom he should do this was deserving, for he loves our nation, and he has built us a synagogue. Verse 6 goes on to say, then Jesus went with them, and when he was already not far from the house, the centurion sent friends to him. Notice the centurion doesn't come out himself again. Just sends some friends out of the house to go talk to Jesus, saying to him, Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I am not worthy that you should enter under my roof. And therefore I did not even think myself worthy to come to you. But say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I also am a man placed under authority, having soldiers under me. And I say to one, go, and he goes. And another, come, and he comes. And I say to my servant, do this, and he does it. And when Jesus heard these things, he marveled at him and turned around and said to the crowd that followed him, I say to you, I have not found such great faith, not even in Israel. And those who were sent, returning to the house, found the servant well who had been sick. Jesus marveled at him. So why did Jesus marvel? Well, let me give you 5 reasons here today. The outlines are in your bulletin, so hopefully you've grabbed one of those so that you can follow along and fill that out. But one of the reasons that I believe Jesus marveled is because he marveled that this centurion compassionately cared for his servant. Before we even get to his faith, I want to think for a moment about his character. Some Romans historically treated their servants without any compassion. They treated their servants like they were mere tools. Barclay again mentions in his commentary, he's quoting from a Roman writer, he says there was a Roman writer on estate management who recommended the farmer needed to examine his implements every year and to throw out those implements which are old and broken, and to do the same with his slaves. Just treat your slaves, if they're old and broken, like you would an old farm implement, and throw them out. Clearly, this dehumanizes the slave and places them on a par with any other farm implement. But we see that this centurion treats his slave far different than that. There is a profound respect for this suffering servant, and the master seeks the very best physician he can find to treat this servant who is dear to him, who is sick, and who is ready to die, chapter 7, verse 2 says. I want you to think about the times that people petitioned Jesus in Scripture. You can find instances where some petitioned Jesus for their son. You can find times where people petition Jesus for their daughter. You can find times when people petition Jesus for a family member. You can certainly find lots of instances where people petition Jesus for themselves. But can you think of any other person who petitions Jesus on behalf of a slave? And this says something about the character of this centurion. I want you to think about this for a moment and consider a point we might consider in 21st century America. The most successful bosses are the ones who personally care for their employees. Some bosses, when you're sick or you're grieving, they show very little compassion for you. They just kind of put out the now hiring sign and they just look for the next replacement. They have a next man up, move on mentality. But those who will get the most out of their employees, the most dedication, the most loyalty out of their employees, are bosses who will demonstrate they care genuinely for their workers and they treat them as more than just a tool and just a number. Special instructions were given in scriptures actually to masters about how to treat their servants and to servants about how to respect their masters. Because Jesus didn't want us to dehumanize one another. He wanted us to treat one another as human beings created in the image of God. And that goes for any relationship that we have with other people. And so Jesus marvels because it was rare to find a man who had been hardened by war, who still had a tender heart to those who are suffering. You know, there's another thing that we might consider as we think of this soldier. It would be easy to stereotype this soldier and this slave owner, as we do so many other people. Sometimes we think, oh, slave owner, they must be cruel. Oh, we think soldier, well, they must take advantage of their role as soldiers. They must be brutal. We do this sometimes with other positions and roles, right? When we think of a sailor, we think, oh, they must cuss like a sailor, right? We look at politicians and think, oh, those politicians, every time their lips are moving, they're lying. Some people have been trained to think of cops as all cops are dirty cops. And we have that mentality that's being brainwashed into our thinking. We need to realize that we can find people with good hearts in nearly every sphere of life. We think of people in certain professions and roles to be hardened sinners, but what Jesus shows us from this is that our stereotypes can be wrong. Sometimes we need to marvel that there are people who are surrounded by brutal warriors, inflated possibly by their own personal success. We would think that about the centurion, that he was under the headship of a wicked Roman Empire, but he still was God-fearing and neighbor-loving. It is possible. So we need to be careful that we're not people who stereotype others because of the roles they have or the positions they hold. This centurion acts compassionately for his servant. But a second thing about him that we'll notice that he acted decisively on behalf of his servant. His compassion didn't just stop at having this heartstrings feeling towards his servant. He does something about it, and that's important. Sometimes we have a compassionate feeling, but we don't act on the feeling. We're kind of like the priest and Levite who see the person on the side of the road and, oh, I feel sorry for him, but I'm just going to keep on walking. The person that was commended was the Samaritan who actually took the time to go and treat the person who was on the side of the road, and he did something about his compassion. And we see this with this centurion as well. And so Jesus commends this man's faith because it is a faith that is quick and it is responsive. It acts urgently in response to the need. So as soon as this man hears, chapter 7, verse 3 says, about Jesus, he sent elders of the Jews to him, pleading with him to come and heal his servant. And so a question we also must ask as we think about this person's character and we compare our own as we try to be reflective here this morning is, are you the type of person who is quick to respond to a crisis by turning to Jesus? Jesus marvels at this centurion who was quick to believe and he was quick to trust Jesus, while there were so many of the Jewish nation who sought to undermine and entrap Jesus. We need more urgency on behalf of others if we truly believe in the power of God. I'll ask you something as we try to apply this lesson to ourselves. How many of you have friends or coworkers and you've been meaning to talk to them about Jesus? You've been meaning to tell them how Jesus could help their life. You've been meaning to invite them to church. You've been meaning to tell them about the grace of Jesus and the love of Jesus and the hope of Jesus and the purpose that they can find in Jesus. But you haven't done it yet. You're not acting with urgency. If you see that there's a need, we need to act more urgently towards those who are in need. The centurion's impressive because he's not a procrastinator. He is someone who acts urgently, quickly to get the solution for his suffering servant. A third thing that we think of when we think of the centurion is that he has clearly a positive reputation too. That positive reputation is forged by love and by service. You notice that the Jews come to Jesus to make this request, and that was probably pretty smart on the centurion's part. He's a Gentile. He may be thinking to himself, well, Jesus, if he is a Jew, he may not want to talk to me as a Gentile. He certainly may not want to talk to me if he finds out that I'm a Roman centurion. And just in case he doesn't want to talk to me, I'm going to go ahead and send some of my Jewish friends to go talk to him. Because he might be more likely and willing to talk to a Jew than he will a Gentile. He doesn't know, but it seems like a pretty good idea, and it works. So he sends his Jewish friends out to go make this request of Jesus. And when the Jews are pleading with Jesus, they make a very interesting remark about the centurion. They say in verses 4 and 5, they say he is deserving. Jesus, don't think of him like any other Gentile or some other centurion. No, he deserves it. He deserves for you to heal his servant. He deserves to have this request. Please do this. Why? Because he loves our nation. A lot of Romans didn't reflect love for the nation of Israel. But this person is different. He loves our nation. And secondly, he himself has built us a synagogue. He's actually built us a place of worship. Now, some people, they only know us in our professional roles, and so they only see one side of our character. And it's easy to fake people out when all that you see is what you see across the desk. But clearly, these people know him not just as a centurion, but a member of the community, a neighbor. And they know him as a good neighbor, and he's a good person. So they see this man in his home life, and they speak highly of him to Jesus, having noted some of his kind deeds in the community. I want to take a moment to show you something. It's a couple of pictures here that are actually from Capernaum. But this is an aerial view of the remains of the Capernaum synagogue. And one of the things I try to point out when I have the opportunity to do so is the Bible is a book about real people in real places at real times. And I just want you to see that this isn't some made-up fictional story from Luke chapter 7. This is the synagogue in Capernaum that you could still go visit the remains of today. Now, the remains that you see here are considered to be from the 4th century CE. However, they are built on the top of a synagogue, which is from the 1st century in Capernaum. And so this is built up on top of the 1st century synagogue that perhaps this centurion had built. Pretty nice, wouldn't you say? How much you think it costs to build a synagogue like that in today's numbers? I don't know. I don't have any estimates for you. But I know that it seems pretty impressive that someone who was a Roman would build a synagogue like this for the Jews. And so here's archaeological evidence that such a synagogue did exist, perhaps the very location of the one the centurion had built. So this was rare. So it's very rare to find a man like this. Very rare because many Romans hated the Jews. In fact, do you know what some of the Romans called the Jews? They called them a filthy race. That was what some of the Romans called the Jews. Anti-Semitism is not new. Anti-Semitism is an ancient hatred. It has gone on since long before the time of Jesus, and it has continued up until now. But this person doesn't give in to the common hatred of the Jews. This Roman had a respect for the Jewish people, and the Jewish people had an admiration for him as a notable friend and an ally in their community. And so they come to Jesus on behalf of him and say, this person is deserving. He truly loves us. He's even built a synagogue for us. He is deserving. Now, I want you to think about something here as well. Do you ever feel like people don't notice or recognize you? Are you one of those people that sometimes thinks to yourself, I don't feel like I get the recognition that I should get? You know, I'll tell you, in almost every church, there's somebody who says, I don't even know why I even come. Nobody even notices me. First of all, let me tell you something. The church isn't about us getting noticed. It is about noticing the one who deserves all the glory, and that's God. But if you've ever thought like this, I want you to learn something from this centurion. They would never have recognized this centurion who just came and sat on a synagogue pew and went to work and minded his business, and that was all there was to his faith. If you want to be recognized, then take a page out of the centurion's handbook. You need to love other people and serve other people. And I promise you, other people will recognize you. This doesn't mean that you need to build somebody a synagogue. We know not everybody can do that. You don't have to do that to get noticed. That will certainly do it. I've known people that have donated money so the church could have land, or I've known people that have donated money so the church could build a building. Well, you're certainly getting remembered and noticed if you do something like that. That's pretty big, though. It's pretty big. But there are things you can do that are simple. Jesus talks about some of them in Matthew chapter 25. You can give someone clothes who needs some clothes. You can give somebody a cup of cold water who needs a cup of cold water. You can go visit somebody who's sick or who is in prison who needs visited. You can lend a helping hand. You can cook somebody a meal. You can offer to pray for someone who's suffering. You can go up and you can genuinely welcome and greet someone and get to know them and show true interest in their life. And I promise you, if you show love and you serve people, you will start to notice that they notice you for it. And they will want to return the favor. I want to back up to Luke chapter 6 and read a verse that we had to kind of go over quickly in our last lesson on Luke. But notice Luke chapter 6 and verse 38. Because I don't think this principle is an unbiblical principle that we're bringing out here. I think it's exactly what Jesus taught in verse 38. He says in verse 38, give, and it will be given to you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over will be put into your bosom. Now, what does that mean? What does that mean? I want you to imagine that you're cooking some food and you have some company that's coming over and you find out that you don't have enough flour. But the only thing is you're living in the first century and there's not a grocery store down the street. And so what you have to do, because you can't go to the grocery store down the street or the grocery store is closed, then you have to go and knock on your neighbor's door. And you say, neighbor, I've got friends coming over and I'm trying to cook some bread. And so I need some bread. So I need some flour so I can cook this bread. Could you loan me some flour? Your neighbor has one of two options. Well, they have really three options. They can shut the door on you and say, no, get out of my house. You know, I'm busy. I don't want to loan you any flour. Well, that's pretty harsh. They can loan you some flour, but maybe they don't want to give you very much flour because, and so they kind of just take that really quick scoop. But you know, when you take a quick scoop of some flour, sometimes there's little air pockets and gaps, and maybe you're not going to get quite enough. Or they can take that big scoop of flour, they can push it down, and they can fill it up so that it's running over the top so that you not only have enough flour, you have more than enough flour to take home. And when your neighbor comes and knocks on your door, when they want some flour, when they run out of flour one day, what are you going to want to do? Well, these people were really good to me in a time of crisis, and because they were really good to me, I want to make sure that I'm very generous with them. Give, and it will be given to you. The centurion had given to the Jewish nation, the people in Capernaum, and they wanted to find a way that they could give back to him. And so give, serve, love, and people will begin to take notice. Greatness comes by service. Jesus marveled because here was a centurion who didn't join in the disrespect of the Jews with his Roman companions, but he loved them and he loved them sacrificially. Well, a fourth thing that we might think about as we think about this Roman centurion, this is just another close-up picture of the synagogue. But a fourth thing that we might consider as we think of this Roman centurion is that the centurion possessed a personal humility as well. Even though he had done a lot of good things, he wasn't arrogant about it. He himself never says, I deserve this. Other people said that for him. Other people said that about him, but he didn't say that about himself. This centurion is humble. There's a couple of things that show up in the text that indicate his humility. First of all, he may have been familiar with the Jewish custom of not entering a Gentile household. And so he himself does not go to Jesus as a Gentile, and he himself does not even expect Jesus to walk inside of his door. You notice that Jesus heals this servant and he never even walks in the house. He doesn't have to lay his hands physically on someone to heal them. He actually can heal from a distance. He had done it in John 4. Perhaps the centurion had heard of that, by the way. But he does it again here in Luke chapter 7. And so, because the centurion perhaps understands the customs of the Jews and that it may be rude to try to impose upon something that Jesus wasn't comfortable with, he says, Lord, just say a word. Don't think that you have to come into my house. I know I'm a Gentile. I know I'm a Roman. I know that I'm not even worthy for you as God to come into my house, but just say the word, and I know you can do this. He tells Jesus, I am not worthy that you should enter under my roof. Therefore, I didn't even think myself worthy to come to you. Now think about that coming from who it's coming from. This guy has one of the best jobs in the Roman government. He's the commander of 100 men. He's got a good job. He's a commander of 100 men in the greatest army in the world at this time. But he doesn't even feel like he deserves a house visit from Jesus, who's a carpenter from Nazareth. That should tell us something. One of the things that it tells us is if you think that you are somehow worthy of Jesus, then you have no idea what a contrast exists between yourself and the Son of God. Jesus is sinless. We are sinful. Jesus is the Savior. We are the people needing saved. Jesus is supreme. We are subpar because we are all sinners, fallen short of God's glory. Centurion understands where he stands in comparison to Jesus. John the Baptizer understood that. He once said in Luke 3:16, he says, I'm not even worthy to strap the sandals of Jesus. That's like him saying, I don't even deserve to be the lowest slave in Jesus' household. I don't even deserve to tie a shoe. That's how I compare. Even though lots of people are coming to me and I'm preaching to lots of people and people are asking me if I'm the Christ. No, but I'm not even worthy to strap a sandal. That's humility. And this centurion was humble. Jesus marvels because here is a man who could have been filled with ego and pride, but he was egoless. These were the types of people, by the way, that Jesus could best help. These are still the types of people that Jesus can best help. People who are full of themselves. They don't want more of Jesus. Feel like they're doing just fine on their own, but people who recognize their own emptiness can be filled by him. Blessed are, Jesus says, the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who empty themselves so that he can fill them up. And that leads us to our last point. That is, the centurion was filled. He was filled even before Jesus came with genuine faith. I can only imagine that his faith was stronger after Jesus came. But the centurion was filled with genuine faith. Jesus had just arrived in Capernaum. Yet the centurion believes in the power of Jesus to speak and to heal sight unseen. And I think there's a lesson for us. How many times have we heard someone say, well, I just can't believe in Jesus if I don't see Jesus? I remember someone telling me that. This kid had been raised in the church. Father was a preacher. He was about 18 years old. And they said, why haven't you become a Christian yet? I know you know a lot. You would talk to him. He knows Scripture. He knows what the Bible says. So I just feel like if I don't ever actually see Jesus with my own eyes and touch him, I'll never be able to believe. By the way, a few years later, he did become a Christian. He did become a believer. But when he was 18, that's how he felt. People say things like that, and I have to ask you, do you believe in the president? Because I've never personally seen the president, but I believe he's the president. You're like, oh, well, there's video cameras. Okay, well, I've never seen the first president of the U.S. on camera, but I still believe George Washington was the first president. I still believe Abraham Lincoln was the 16th. I never saw him either. The centurion believed because of the testimony that he had heard and trusted. And perhaps this was the same testimony that he'd heard about a similar miracle. True faith believes the reliable testimony of witnesses. Tonight, we're going to think a little bit about the historical Jesus. We're going to think about the witnesses to Jesus. We're going to think about that because that's a common issue people have. I have a hard time believing if I can't see. What did Jesus once tell Thomas, who did touch and who did see him with his own eyes? Thomas once was told by Jesus, blessed are those who have not seen, yet have believed. Centurion, even though he hadn't seen Jesus, he had heard enough to know there's something special about this Jesus person, and I think this Jesus is the one who can help my servant. And so Jesus marveled at the faith of the centurion because while the Jews kept demanding signs of Jesus, I want to see more, we want more, the centurion had heard enough. And he trusted that Jesus could do what others said he was doing. They had no reason to make it up. So I'm just going to trust Jesus. I'm going to say, Jesus, I tell people to go and they go. I tell people to come and they come. I tell people to do and they do. And I know that if you're the Son of God, that's exactly what you can do for my servant. So just go ahead and do it. And when they get back home, servant is healed. And that tells us something finally, because our faith is not in the centurion. Our faith is in Jesus. That tells us something finally about Jesus. And that is Jesus responds to our urgent requests and our needs with compassion. The conclusion of this episode helps us to see the centurion's faith in Jesus is justified. Jesus indeed heals the centurion's servant from a distance. He proves again he is the Son of God. That's the point of every miracle, to prove he's the Son of God. It's not about doing people favors. It's about proving that I have come from heaven and I can take you to heaven with me if you'll just have faith in me. So he's the Son of God, but it tells us also about his character, that we have a God who is not an uncaring God, but a God who is also compassionate. For the rest of this month, we're going to be taking a look at things in Luke chapter 7. I will not be with you next week. I'll be preaching in Columbus, Ohio. I did not realize that was Easter Sunday next week when I scheduled that, so I feel like a total idiot for doing that because I hate to be gone on Easter Sunday because we normally have a few more extra visitors and things like that. But Mike is going to do you're preaching tomorrow. You're preaching next week. You know that, right, Mike? So Mike is going to do a fantastic job next week for you in preaching. He's going to be extra fired up and pumped up, and I know he's going to do great. But I do hate that I'm not going to be here next week. So this is your shot, all right? This is it next week, okay? I'm going to be praying for you. You guys pray for me. But there's some other instances in Luke chapter 7 that indicate the compassion of Jesus, every single one of them. Jesus shows compassion in Luke 7:11 through 17 towards a grieving widow in a funeral procession who has lost her only son. At the end of the chapter, what you're going to find is Jesus shows compassion to a sinner who is showing gratitude in the best way that she knows how for the forgiveness that Jesus is offering her. In verses 18 through 35, Jesus shows compassion to someone who is unjustly suffering in prison. That's John, who is eventually going to be beheaded for the sake of Jesus. And John wants to know, is the Christ really the Christ? Is Jesus really the Christ? Because I'm in prison, I'm about to die for it. I'd really like to know if I'm believing in someone for the right reasons. And Jesus helps bring the evidence that John needs that he might believe. Over and over again, when you read Luke chapter 7, what you're going to find, one of the key points is the compassion of Jesus. For every individual in their own unique situations and trials, Jesus has compassion upon us. And at this moment, whatever trial that you're facing, some of you are grieving, some of you are facing trials in your own home life. Some of you are facing trials when it comes to sin. You're facing addictions. You're dealing with those things. Some of you are concerned about what you're going to do with the future. I've got kids that are thinking about, what am I going to do for a career? What am I going to do when it comes to college? There's people thinking about, am I ever going to find a mate? Am I ever going to find someone who's going to be good for me spiritually, that I can be good for them? Am I going to be blessed in that way? And we all have trials. We all have things that we're dealing with. And whatever the trial is, one of the things that we learn from this chapter, from the broad overview of this chapter, is that Jesus cares about every situation that you're in, whatever it is. And so bring your prayers and bring your requests and bring your concerns to him. We have a grandma and grandpa who are about to head over to Illinois, right? Because you're concerned about this new baby that's about to be born. Bring your concerns to Jesus.